Good afternoon. Growing up, I realized very early on that the way the world unfolded before me was very differently than it did for my sisters or my classmates. I learned completely different than other kids. I often misheard directions, and landmark childhood skills like drawing a straight line or tying my shoes was a struggle for me. When I went to school, I often misheard the directions of the teachers, didn't always meet the expectations for assignments. So my time in education reduced itself to an hour-by-hour struggle for survival. It's about that time in third grade that I became identified as a student with special education needs. When I spent time in the special education classroom, I began to notice that I was surrounded with the same type of children. Children who were very intelligent, who had a thirst to be heard, but teachers didn't seem to know how to teach them. Most common obstacle was a lack of concentration. The teachers would say, concentrate. Somehow, myself, as well as my classmates, were supposed to magically understand how to perform this abstract task. How do you concentrate? And what are the steps of concentration? As the steps of concentration were not clearly communicated to us, behaviors began to arise. And unfortunately, one of the unimaginable responses occurred. The teachers kind of began to ignore us. We became known as the Unteachable Kids. And as my time in education began to continue, I was in classes with the same types of kids. And what I noticed was as the minds of other children began to be challenged and fostered, ours became more narrow and more limited. Reflecting on many of those students, I found out many of them dropped out of school, struggled with substance abuse, and some sadly resided inside of prison. Concentration is a unique skill, takes many forms. And my struggles with concentration were very similar to other children with the same struggles. Like I said, I often misheard directions, verbal cues I didn't always pick up on, and reading was the most daunting of all those tasks. From starting at the left side of the page, to coding words, hoping to get to the right side of the page. About the middle of the page, back to the left side of the page, because I had forgotten the words I had originally decoded. Unfortunately, because I didn't meet the expectations of the teachers, began to very negatively and drastically impact my self-esteem. Became more withdrawn, didn't really see the value in school. The turnaround occurred for me on a warm summer afternoon. My father enrolled me in a local martial arts school with the hope of instilling me some kind of confidence. And there I met a man that completely changed the course of my life. His name was Becker. Sean Becker taught me that concentration had to start with a very clear vision. I had to have a clear vision inside my mind of what I wanted to do. After I had a clear vision, I'd hold my breath, start with my stomach muscles, breathe in my nose, out through my mouth, and slowly take the steps towards my goal. I started to apply this in every form of martial arts. It didn't matter if it was a kick, a punch, a stance, even tying my belt. Started with visualization, and I just loved it. Slowly as the years went on, concentration or martial arts began to take up all of my free time. I didn't really care about belts, I didn't care about trophies. I was really good at something, and the need to develop a deeper understanding slowly swallowed me up. I started taking those steps that Sean had talked about. I started to apply them in all avenues of my life. Didn't matter if I was writing my name on a piece of paper, if I had to sit still in class. I began with that visualization, and I began to hold my breath in my nose, out my mouth. It would continue. And despite my high school guidance counselor telling me, Matt, kids like you don't go to college, I proved them wrong. I'm now very proud to say that I run a very successful martial arts school, on top of having 3 graduate degrees. And the first step on that journey was just learning to concentrate. Special education, my career in special education, chose me. I didn't really choose it. And meeting my first class I was assigned to teach for the first time was almost like an echo of my past experiences. My first class was boundless in their abilities and fueled by curiosity. And the most common obstacle was a lack of concentration. I didn't always share my knowledge of the martial arts with students because I was afraid of being seen as that teacher that was too distractible, not focused on curriculum, not focused on goals, data, and student achievement. But as my years in public education as a teacher began to unfold, I started to kind of notice that my students were thirsty for the types of interactions that martial arts foster. And this is where I realized that we kind of tell ourselves a story about children. And that story is that a very well-behaved child, and a child who is sitting quietly, well, that's the child that's learning. And the child that's misbehaving is the child that's not learning. And I started to ask myself this question. I said, what do these children with so much kinetic insight have to say? How would they express the world through motion? And maybe their thoughts are coming out through motion. So it was with the encouragement of Paul, as well as some of the other attendees at this conference, that I began to teach Filipino martial arts to my class. If I could have some assistance, please. Now, before they start, thank you, John. Before they start, you have to realize you have to have a clear vision of what you want. Not only do you have to have a clear vision, you have to be reciprocating in your patience. You have to be reciprocating with your positive energy. So I'm going to go ahead and let these gentlemen demonstrate for a second. Go ahead, gentlemen. Thank you. Quick round of applause for that. Thank you so much. Teaching that to my class, and I realized that my students had to have the patience and the vision. I began teaching this every day in my class, and I noticed some very fascinating trends started to occur. Office referrals for the students, both in my class and out of the class, began to decrease. Reading scores actually began to increase. I thought, what a very interesting trend. My students were so proud of this, they started talking about this to some other teachers, saying, Mr. Stumpf does this weird magic with sticks. So one of my physical education teachers, who's a coworker of mine, said, I want to learn this. Can we come to the classroom? I said, absolutely. So I tell my students, I pump them up, I tell them, I said, the physical education department is going to come and we're going to teach them how to do this. As the physical education teachers came to my classroom, the students looked at me and they were expecting me to teach it. And I said, no, that's not my job. I said, I've taught this to you. I want you to teach. I want you to teach these teachers. And what ended up happening was extremely fascinating. I taught all of the students from a chambered position, as you saw Paul and Conrad demonstrate. I taught all of the students from a chambered position, moving to another chambered position. But as I could see my students developing that vision of how they wanted to communicate with the teachers, some actually started from an open position and moved to a closed position. Some started from a closed position and then moved to an open position and chambered on the other side. As I saw each student develop a vision, they began to concentrate and began to execute that plan for every teacher. And what was interesting was within 4 minutes, the entire physical education department at my school could do having six. Children who could have very easily been labeled unteachable were teaching educators about something that is very new and innovative in education. I was very, very grateful to have an experience such as that. My classes began what we call the 1-minute challenge. The 1-minute challenge means that the students have to engage in heaven six back and forth for a period of 1 minute without speaking, without saying any words. And at the end of the 1 minute, they have to say something positive to their partner about something they did better. Did they have a better angle? Did they have better energy? Did they have a smoother execution drill? The 1-minute challenge has become a very intricate and important part of our classroom culture. At the end of the 1-minute challenge, and I noticed a lot of the reading scores are going up, I told my students, I said, you guys, we need to have a reward for this. We should have a reward for the amount of time that we can do having six. And 2 of my students said, no, Mr. Stumpf, we can't do that. Now this goes against all conventional thinking in education. In education, we usually offer a reward for a task. And then the students do the task and get the reward. And I said, why don't you want a reward for this? And one of my students said, Mr. Stumpf, this stuff's amazing and it really helps. If we put a price on it or a reward, it doesn't have value anymore. A child who could have very easily been seen as unteachable just taught me about the things that are really important in our education system. The practice of martial arts goes back thousands of years, and the need to preserve oneself is quite arguably the most important need that anyone can ever internally possess. But in this new age, with technologies and medications and data, martial arts has a new and deeper meaning. And those tools used by our earliest ancestors to preserve our food and our culture are now needed to sharpen and strengthen the concentration and minds of our youth. Thank you very much.